Welcome back to the Marvel Movie Minute, a daily podcast in which we explore the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe 1 minute at a time. In this, our fourth season, we're looking at Kenneth Branagh's 2011 film, Thor. I'm Matthew Fox from theethicalpanda.com.
And I'm Andy Nelson from the Next Reel Film Podcast.
And today we're talking about minute 29, which begins with Thor yelling at his dad and ends with Odin bringing down the hammer on Thor. Sorry, I had to. And today we've got a very special guest, something I've been excited about for a while. Joining us on the show today, we have a Shakespearean guest here who's going to really help us touch on all the royal family drama in this minute. Welcome, Dr. Jeff Wilson from the Harvard College Writing Program. Jeff, I'm so glad you're with us. Why do you pick this? I know you wanted this one particular minute. Why'd you pick this minute?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, so much for having me. Thor is my 9-year-old daughter's favorite Avenger. And so I jumped at the chance. Nice. I had to get on here.
Nice.
Kind of inverting the theme of Thor a little bit. This is a parent looking for acceptance from his daughter. And to be This moment, this is the moment, right, when Odin banishes Thor and says, "You're not worthy." It's sort of the conceptual center of the film, and so much kind of refers to this moment or descends from this moment in a number of really fascinating ways, both in terms of kind of plot and themes. So with plot, you get this kind of basic Odysseus story in Thor, right, of a guy trying to get back home. And with the themes, you get the tension between father and son, plus the question of how to wield power responsibly. But for me, what's most fascinating about this moment as a Shakespeare scholar is that in this scene, you have a veteran Shakespearean actor, Anthony Hopkins, absolutely crushing the scene that he shares with a Hollywood celebrity that is then overheard and reacted to by a rising Shakespearean star, Tom Hiddleston, and directed by the most important Shakespearean filmmaker of the past 60 years, Kenneth Branagh. So it seems like this minute just sort of so much is centered around this for the entire film and then the way that the movie was made and the way that it was made. So looking forward to chatting with you about it.
Awesome. So much to talk about. We'll get right back to that in just one moment.
We have our Season 4 artwork up on t-shirts, mugs, pillows, all sorts of stuff over in our merch store. If you're looking to support the show and, kind of flash some of the swag that we have, check out the merch store at truestory.fm/Marvel Movie Minute and just click on merch.
Jeff, I love where you started talking about this minute. I want to kind of step back to kind of look at the bigger picture for 1 second. Tell us about how you sort of came to this movie. Had you heard that, had someone mentioned to you that Branagh had talked about, wanting to make this movie because of the Shakespearean themes? Did you, kind of go into it blind? For you, as someone who really knows Branagh and Shakespeare, what was your thought when you've heard this, Shakespearean legend in the last 60 years was making a comic book movie?
Right. Yeah. So, kind of word in Shake's world was that Kenneth Branagh is going to direct a major Hollywood blockbuster. And we all kind of raise our eyebrows at that a little bit. And then he says, "I'm doing it because it's the story of Prince Hal from the first part of Henry IV. And then we all say, okay, that kind of makes sense because Kenneth Branagh had his big moment in 1989 with the film Henry V, which was kind of the very first of these
absolutely.
Sort of big Hollywood Shakespeare blockbusters that became prominent in the 1990s. And so he's got a really close connection to that character. And then to hear him say that this story from Norse mythology that they're now going to make into a Hollywood popcorn movie, that he's doing it for Shakespearean reasons was fascinating to hear. And then you see sort of Branagh's network where he brings in Anthony Hopkins, who I think just signed on to do the film, knowing nothing about the story of Thor, but knowing Kenneth Branagh and really liking him as a director.
Right.
And Branagh brings along Tom Hiddleston, who he'd worked with on the TV series Wallander, but Tom Hiddleston's, of course, also a Shakespearean actor. He'd just come off of Othello and playing, a character like Cassio. He'd played a really celebrated Coriolanus. And so you've got these Shakespearean actors and directors who are bringing that language and that way of storytelling to this major Hollywood blockbuster. And we sort of, maybe it was rubberneck train wreck style, but we had to see just how is this going to work.
What was your feeling when you did get to see it? Did you kind of walk away going, Ken, what in the world were you thinking? Or did you sort of go, oh, okay, yeah, I get what you meant?
Marvel movies are the one thing that my wife and I can agree upon in terms of entertainment that we choose. And I think the reason that I like them is because they're exploring these big, conceptual themes and they're doing it sort of interlacing comedy and tragedy. And yeah, I think I saw it and weirdly kind of works. It works that to kind of make a Shakespearean sensibility a little bit more accessible on a major film screen, and then also to kind of bring some of those storytelling methods to a Hollywood blockbuster that we sort of experience a lot within Shakespeare world. I hear that on the set, the actors and directors were sort of, they would talk in Shakespearean shorthand back and forth, that they would say, what if we did a little Edmund and King Lear in this moment? And then all the Shakespeareans sort of understand what that means.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that. It really was it wasn't just sort of in Branagh's head, but he was actually bringing it to the actors. And the few non-Shakespearean folks on stage must have been very frustrated with that process. But
well, what I love about that idea is that Shakespeare really was kind of the stories of the people. It wasn't some like high English royal sort of storytelling. It was something that was kind of for everybody. For those who aren't as familiar with Shakespeare, can you just explain when you kind of referenced how Branagh was coming to this saying that it's kind of the story of Prince Hal. Can you just give a taste of what that story is and how it might fit into kind of what he was seeing with this one?
The story of Prince Hal comes in what's called Shakespeare's second tetralogy. So a tetralogy is a group of 4 plays. So you can think of the Star Wars trilogy, right? And there's sort of the first trilogy and the second trilogy. Well, Shakespeare, of course, has to outdo Star Wars, and he does sets of 4 plays. So early in the 1590s, Shakespeare writes what's called his first tetralogy. And that's sort of the story of what's called the Wars of the Roses, this bloody English Civil War that culminates in Richard III, who Shakespeare kind of presents as this hilarious yet also really deplorable villain. And then Shakespeare ends that story in the mid-1590s. And then, in true Star Wars fashion, he says, I want to tell the prequel to that story. So let's flash back to what happened in the lead up to this set of 4 plays that I've already told. And then he writes what's called his second tetralogy, his second set of 4 plays. And those plays are Richard II, the first and the second part of Henry IV, and then Henry V. He writes these in the second half of the 1590s. So Richard II is the story of this fellow named Henry Bolingbroke, kind of overthrowing King Richard II, a divinely appointed king. And Bolingbroke is, just to sort of contextualize things, he's going to kind of go on to be the Odin figure in this story. So in the first part of Henry IV, what happens is that this noble and warlike King Henry IV, he's recently deposed Richard II. He's taken the English throne for himself, but he's disappointed in this dissolute son who he has, the heir to the crown, who spends all of his time drinking in the pubs in Eastcheap. And so the son, Prince Hal, the person who will eventually go on to become Henry V, at the end of the second scene, he has this amazing soliloquy where he says, I know I'm wasting my life away in the pubs and with these drinking buddies of mine, but I'm going to go on to do great things. Just you wait and see. And so we have that kind of contextualization. Mm-hmm. This is going to be an overcoming adversity story, or, a coming out of the shadows, rags to riches type story. So we get that framing, but then Hal kind of spends all of his time with his favorite drinking buddy, the jolly knight, Sir John Falstaff. He's a Volstagg figure for Thor fans. Hal says once he becomes king, he's going to reject Falstaff. He's going to reject his old lifestyle. The young Hal and some of his friends then end up joining the civil war that's going on in England. And then at what's called the Battle of Shrewsbury, Hal, who's now 17 years old, fights heroically, saves his father's life, helps win the war against these rebels. Henry IV, our Odin figure, later dies. So then at the age of 27, Prince Hal becomes King Henry V. And at his coronation, Henry V does indeed reject Falstaff, his former friend. Only 2 years later, then, at the age of 29, Henry V wins the famous victory at the Battle of Agincourt, where England reclaims these lands that had previously been lost in France. Then he marries Catherine of Valois and settles down to rule over a time of kind of peace and prosperity in England. So when he dies at the young age of 36, Henry V is sort of celebrated in England as this national hero.
Interesting. Okay.
I love getting all that context, especially because what we've been talking about as we watch this Thor movie, it's really interesting, especially because now we've seen things like Ragnarok and Avengers. But also, we know that Thor goes on to become this epic war leader and of this wonderful way. And for me, you say Henry V, and I just immediately think of the St. Crispin's Day speech, which I'm a total pacifist. You tell me, all the nobles asleep in their beds will wish they were here with us. I'm like, yeah, I'd go to fight with you, Prince Hal. So I love how much there really is, not just in this movie, but the Thor and the Prince Hal story are such great mirrors of each other.
Yeah, and apparently Branagh gave Chris Hemsworth the St. Crispin's Day speech at one point when they were rehearsing and said, come to set tomorrow and be able to deliver this. And could you imagine being Chris Hemsworth kind of cast in this movie as this sort of amazingly good-looking, super well-built Hollywood-style actor and being told, come and do this speech from Shakespeare. Oh, and Anthony Hopkins and Tom Hiddleston will also be there.
Yeah, right. A little pressure, just a bit.
You kind of hope at some point they do get Chris onto a stage, because you mentioned Tom Hiddleston in Othello, and I guess especially how young he would be, Cassio makes sense. But just given the evil he plays, I immediately started thinking I now need to see him as Iago one day, because he'd be so perfect for that. So,
that would be fun.
Well, we are supposed to be talking about the specific minute, so let's actually get into that. But I sort of warned Andy that I was going to be like, let's just go deep on this.
Yeah.
And so it starts with like the two of them yelling at each other, and especially, this is when like Thor calls him and says, "You're an old man and a fool." And then look at these great reaction shots. It just feels like there's so much resentment that it's like both of these have been holding on to what they've said for so long, and they're finally saying it. Now they're like, oh my God, it's out in the air. What goes through your mind as you're watching the two of them react to what they've just, first as they say it, but then as they kind of react to what they've just said?
A few things. So first of all, we've got, Thor is the key word is unworthy in the scene, right? But right. Thor is an unworthy son in a completely different way than Prince Hal is an unworthy son. Prince Hal is kind of drinking in the pubs and not living up to the royal nobility that his father thinks he should have. Actually, Thor is exactly the kind of son that King Henry IV would have loved to have had. He's a guy who wants to be out there on the battlefield, but in Thor, Odin's point is that you're reckless, you're young, you're impetuous, you're not thinking about qualities of leadership to, prudently manage a government. And instead, you just want to go out and go to war with everyone and prove your honor, prove your toughness out there. So both Prince Hal and Thor are unworthy, but in completely different ways. And that's a really fascinating dynamic. Yeah, as you say in that scene, apparently Ken Branagh told Anthony Hopkins to improvise some lines on that, and that Tom Hiddleston is doing some reaction shots in this minute that we're talking about, and Chris Hemsworth is having some dialogue back and forth. But it's fascinating to see, right, that you've got these Shakespearean actors that are, and the reason that it's important that they're Shakespeare, because, you think about a Shakespeare play, right? We're living in the 21st century. None of us have ever experienced medieval royalty. We don't really have any connection to that world. But to be a good Shakespearean actor, you have to be able to convincingly deliver lines in that sort of heightened style, in the way that a Thor speaks, right? In the way that an Anthony Hopkins as Odin speaks. And they're able to do that in that scene, and it feels convincing, even though we're in this make-believe world of Asgard, which is, kind of a little bit of a funhouse mirror reflection of England. You can even hear the name England in the name Asgard. And that to be able to deliver those lines plausibly is sort of where the Shakespearean training, especially for Anthony Hopkins in this scene, kind of comes through.
Well, and it really, there's a sense of there will be as he continues speaking, but there's a sense of wisdom that he also has. Because clearly they're mad at each other. I mean, Thor is yelling at Dad, Dad's yelling at Thor, you're a vain, greedy, cruel boy, all of which makes sense. And then when Thor says, and you're an old man and a fool, I love how Odin kind of pivots, and that's like that moment of wisdom and reflection that he has, where he's like, yes, and he pauses, I was a fool to think you're ready. I love how he kind of takes that moment, and it makes me think, like, what was his strategy at this point? Was he just bringing Thor back, and was he going to punish him in some capacity, but not necessarily casting him out? Was Thor's reaction here so strong and so angry and so caustic with his father that's kind of what pushes Odin to his decision here? I'm not sure. What do you think?
There's that line earlier in the film where Odin says, "A wise king never seeks out war." So that point you make about kind of wisdom and I mean, this is also sort of basic Spider-Man stuff, right? With great power comes great responsibility, and the royals in Asgard have all of this power. And the big question of this film, Thor, is how do you wield power responsibly? And that's also the big question of kind of superhero genre films in general, is you've got folks who have a lot of power. What do you do with that power? In the early modern age, this is sort of addressed through what's called the Mirror for Magistrates genre, which the Mirror for Magistrates was kind of education of young princes. What does a young prince need to do? What does he need to know in order to grow into the person who might take over as a king one day? And that's basically the story that we get in Thor, is that you have someone who's not quite ready to wield power, has to go through a learning experience, and then becomes the person who is, worthy of that power, as it were.
Then it very much fits, screenwriting 101, right? You have a character who's got a flaw, and you have this character arc, and over the course of the story, they work to kind of find a way to, change so that they can get past that flaw and, have the resolution you're looking for.
And I love knowing that that's a genre, because one thing we'll probably talk about in the next minute is when Odin casts him out, he doesn't say you have to prove you're worthy. He just says, don't let the door hit you on the way out. And I remember thinking, I didn't know at that time, like, is this a test, or is this him saying, and you might never come back? So I don't know how much Branagh had that in thought, but knowing that there's this kind of whole genre where it always is the test like that really helps kind of put it in context.
Yeah, Matthew, right? At the start of Thor how this is going to work out.
I know that. It's a question of, like, what does Odin know? Is Odin, and we'll get into that for sure. And sticking to Odin's reaction there for a second, as you pointed out, Andy, he kind of puts his head down and he looks. When Thor says the thing he does, he looks hurt, but not like Thor's hurt him as much as he's just like, now he's fully realizing what he's not wanted to see until now. Which, by the way, you were talking before about how Shakespearean actors have to make this believable while also, conveying all of this. And to me, that's one of the beauties of this is, like, I've never been in English lore. I've never been a space god fighting the frost giants. I have disappointed my father, though, and like that scene is so, and I've been mad at my father, and that scene is so recognizable. But I'm wondering, like, to me, what I got out of that reaction from Odin is not only is he like hit by it, but at some point he's also kind of wondering, is this my fault? Like, anytime a parent sees a child going so far off the rails, on some level, because Odin's talking about how I have trained you. Did you get that same sense that in some level he's like, I've coddled this kid too much, I've spoiled him too much, I need to now change dramatically?
A little bit. I think for me, Anthony Hopkins, I know, kind of approached Odin this moment in particular as kind of a King Lear moment, which is, in King Lear, he banishes his daughter Cordelia when she doesn't perform her love for him in a way that will satisfy him. And so I think Anthony Hopkins is it's as you say, it's a really relatable moment, even though the circumstances that produced it are completely hocus pocus. But it's a really kind of, speaking now as a father, this moment where you love this person, but you're mixed up with anger, you're mixed up with disappointment, you're mixed up with frustration. You feel like there are obligations that you have to your job with the state at the same time as your child who you've reared and spent every day with. And so when Lear banishes Cordelia, it's pretty clear that we're meant to critique Lear in that moment. And I think Anthony Hopkins sort of, makes himself available for critique in that moment of this might be an overreaction.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. And so we get that reaction, and then for a moment Loki steps in and he just says father, and he gets shouted down. What do you think Loki's thinking?
Does he ever?
What is Loki thinking in this moment? Is he actually concerned? Does he just know like that if he wants to make his father just a little bit angrier because he loves how this is playing out? What do you get from Loki in that moment?
Yeah, Loki's, a fascinating mix. We talked about Falstaff. There's some elements of Falstaff in Loki as kind of the god of mischief and lies, but there's much more going back to King Lear, elements of Edmund, who in King Lear is the illegitimate son of one of the advisors to the king, and creates this plot to make the Earl of Gloucester, who's his father, suspicious of the legitimate son Edgar. That's where Loki's at kind of in this moment, is he sees an opening, right? Is that right. He sort of, he genuinely loves his brother. He has a relationship with him, but he's also got his own things going on in terms of his own ambition. And he's always been a little bit lesser than, he feels like, for his entire life. And he's sort of, Tom Hiddleston's reaction shots in this scene are amazing. You see him sort of doing the in-person public performance of trying to support his brother and trying to maybe oppose his father a little bit at the same time as he's starting to realize how he might game this out.
Right.
Well, that's what I find so interesting about all of it, like rewatching this and just thinking about like, how are these machinations playing out as per what Loki had been trying? I kind of don't think he was expecting it to get to a point where they ended up in Jotunheim. I think that he was hoping that Odin would have stopped them beforehand and still gotten Thor in trouble, but he went along with it and it played out. They obviously didn't die. They made it out of there just in the nick of time. But now, like, I don't think that he was thinking that Thor would get cast out through this whole thing, but I can't help but think he's probably like, wow, okay, this is going almost better than I had planned. And that's what I find so interesting about revisiting the film and looking at Loki and thinking about all of this stuff that he has set in motion just so he can kind of get this end game of being the one who does get to ascend to the throne.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating, right, to go back and watch the first Thor in a post-Loki series world, right?
Yes.
And not only fascinating because now Tom Hiddleston is sort of beefed up a little bit, whereas in Thor, he very purposely kind of thinned down and he wanted to have this lean and hungry look, and he was taking that from Shakespeare's Cassius. And to sort of look back, and this is kind of the fun of it, right? To imagine kind of what's going on now that we know what's happened in the future. And then that's something that's very true to the kind of Shakespeare world as well. These plays are from 400 years ago. Events have happened in the past 400 years that we unavoidably have to look back through that lens to interpret these stories, whether it's looking at Shylock through the perspective of the Holocaust, or it's looking at, the Tempest through the perspective of colonialism, just sort of these later events that happen that influence the way we look back at the stories that maybe we would have read differently previously.
When I mentioned Iago, that's kind of what I think of as Loki, just in that, like, the patience and the watching and the gentle whispering in Thor's ear. But I think you're helping me see something different, which is that whereas Iago is just really this like creature of pure malice in some ways, like, I mean, he's got his reasons. Loki is very torn here, I think, because I think you're right, Andy. I think this may be the kind of thing where, like, you're hoping, your sibling gets sent to bed without dessert, and instead your sibling's getting thrown out in the street, and you're sort of like, well, this is more than I thought, but also I could get his room, like, it's a great opportunity for you. And I think it's such a tribute to Hiddleston's acting that without saying a word, just that one word father, he's able to convey so much emotion through this whole scene.
Yeah. And if Shakespeare had written this scene, what would have happened is that Tom Hiddleston would have turned to the camera, made eye contact with the audience and said, now I've got them. Now I'm going to be able to carry out my evil ruse. That's how Shakespeare writes that scene. But, right. In this sort of naturalized 21st century version, we get really just reaction shots. I think you mentioned maybe one word from Loki in the scene, right? And so we're able to project onto him what may or may not be happening based on interpretation, based on things that we later find out.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like, I love those moments when they happen in some Shakespeare plays, but I would hate it here because what I love so much is the mystery. You know, you don't actually know what Loki is thinking, and you kind of have to try and guess. And I think at some level, Loki may not know what he's thinking. Now we get to that moment we talked about where, you know, Odin is saying you are unworthy, and he goes into this great speech about all the things you're unworthy about. And it's funny because this minute specifically ends with him saying you are unworthy. And I kind of wish it just ended there, but in the next minute we find out it is one more, you know, you're unworthy of this. But talk about like, and as he's saying that, you know, he's like ripping off the parts of his outfit, you know, his battle armor, his cape. What's going on there in terms of the like, he's kind of saying you're unworthy and then he's stripping away, I guess, the signs of Thor's office.
Thor and Odin are having this generational dispute, right? Where it's, Odin says, you're a vain, greedy, and cruel boy. And Thor, you're an old man and a fool. And then there's that key line, the old ways are done, right? So we've got this tension between the old and the new, the old and the young. Again, a very King Lear style dynamic. And then we get, you're a vain, greedy, and cruel boy. And I suppose, I don't know quite what to make of this, but vain, greedy, and cruel, if we sort of look at those specific words, they're not necessarily the words that I would think about with Thor, right? With someone who's been impetuous and trying to go out, but to be vain, greedy, and cruel. So that's an interesting dynamic there. He later calls him arrogant and stupid. You've opened these peaceful realms and innocent lives to the horror and desolation of war. And then we get to the kind of the you are unworthy moment. And it's pretty wild that it's taken this film this long to get to this moment. I think it's almost half an hour into the film before we get sort of the first plot point that sort of gives this story direction. That's a pretty daring move to make for a filmmaker to wait that long into it to give us that moment.
Yeah, we've really kind of built up this whole thing with this first act, and I think this is that intense point where our hero is kind of like set on his path of learning, right? I mean, he's demoted in rank and banished. And I think it's interesting. Actually, Kenneth Branagh talks about how he was referencing the Dreyfus affair from the movie The Life of Emile Zola for this particular moment. And I looked at that film to kind of see what he was talking about. And I found it very interesting because I wasn't familiar with the story of Dreyfus, but he was a leader in the French army who was accused of treason, even though he wasn't the one who had done it. And you find out that the military leaders knew, but they didn't want to get in trouble, so they fictionalized this whole thing to kind of create this drama about him getting demoted. But the process of being stripped of your ranks, I mean, it is a very militaristic, ritualistic thing where, I mean, he's in front of everybody, they come up to him and they rip off all of the badges and the stripes and the little decorations on his outfit, and then they have him walk the ranks as he has been stripped of all of his stuff. And it's an interesting, and I suppose perhaps Shakespearean, and maybe it's just, you know, regular screenwriting way that they put that together here, in the fact that we don't have Odin bring Thor back to the palace to go through this ritualistic process of the demotion and banishment. It's very much an emotional demotion at this point, right? I mean, he kind of does it in this heat of this argument. He strips him of his ranks right here without going anywhere, and banishes him here. And I think that that's an interesting and probably stronger way to do it for the story, and perhaps more Shakespearean.
Yeah, it's the geography here is important, right? We're sort of at a threshold there at the gate, right? Yeah, we're sort of between two worlds, and that is very Shakespearean, not just in the history plays, but, you know, a play like A Midsummer Night's Dream, where you have the city world and then the woods of Athens, and different kind of, you know, metaphysics seem to apply in these two different places. But in this case in particular, we then get this new world of Earth that's kind of brought into this situation, which is where Thor is cast down to. And so now we have a very clear dynamic from the first part of Henry IV, But of course, Branagh's kind of changing things around. So in Henry IV Part 1, you have the court and you have the pub. And there are these two different worlds, and we see different actors and different stories playing out in either of those. Whereas in Thor, you have Asgard and you have Earth, and you still have the court, the royal place. But now the kind of the commoner's place is down here on Earth. And the fascinating thing about Thor is that it kind of flips the first part of Henry IV on its head, because Earth is where Thor goes for his education. It's where he goes in order to have his development. And whereas in the Henry IV plays, the pubs are sort of presented as what's keeping Prince Hal back, as he needs to get outside that world. He needs to get into the noble, the royal world. So there's some interesting kind of political valences going on there in terms of valorizing the things that you learn outside of court instead of the qualities and the values of the court.
Well, it makes a lot of sense too, because it's, so I think my sense is, especially like you said, the vain, greedy part of Odin's sense is that the problem with Thor is that he thinks he walks on water because everyone treats him like he walks on water because he's, Prince Thor. And so it's this idea of like, yeah, you have to go live as a pauper instead of a prince, and I'm totally bastardizing the story, but that idea of, yeah, you've got to be sent out. And I, as someone who makes beer myself, I do kind of like the idea that Earth is the pub of the Asgardian world. So that's also kind of a wonderful way to see it.
I mean, they're breaking mugs there, right?
That's
yeah.
right.
The poor waiters and like janitors in Thor's world, he's breaking things all the time. And Loki helps too. One thing I just want to quick also mention, it's not relevant to this, but with the Dreyfus affair, wonderful historical moment, terrible historical moment, but great to know. And very relevant to that is that Dreyfus was Jewish, which is so there's a lot about anti-Semitism in France at that time.
Absolutely.
Andy, though, I know you want to talk a little bit about the discs on Thor's armor, because they're definitely very significant in the way that they're ripped off.
Well, and those are treated very much like these rankings, especially as Odin is removing them. That is kind of this reference to the Dreyfus affair, which is interesting because you look at the armor and I don't know, I guess I would have just assumed it was armor. And I didn't realize that the way that these discs are put onto these uniforms, onto their actual armor, it is an actual ranking. And so when Thor has his, at this point, it's just the top 2 discs on his 6 discs on the front of his armor removed. That is essentially like removing his rankings. And so I find that really interesting. And now I'm going to be curious as we kind of continue going through the film to look at, what do the fronts of the armor of the Einherjar guards look like? The Warriors 3, Odin. I mean, I know Odin has some of the discs on his we can see in this particular scene, but I'm curious to see. I haven't found anything as far as like breaking down the Asgardian armor as to like what the different rankings mean, but I do think that's an interesting way that they actually incorporated the rankings into the design of the armor here.
Yeah, odd just sort of historical footnote. In early modern England, there are what were called sumptuary laws, which were if you existed in this class, you could wear these clothes, but if you were below this class, you could wear those clothes over there, and that was obviously theater presented a really big problem to that, right? Because you have working actors who are dressing up like kings and queens and high royalty, even though the law said they shouldn't be wearing those clothes. And so, I don't even imagine how early modern England would have responded if someone was dressed as an Asgardian god.
Yeah. It's
yeah,
a great thing to think about. Well, Jeff, so kind of wrapping up, is there any other last points about this minute you wanted to bring up that we haven't touched on yet?
I think we have to at least cover in the first Avengers film, then when Thor shows up on Earth and he gets into this debate with Iron Man, Tony Stark, and Thor says to Iron Man, "You have no idea what you're dealing with." And Tony Stark says back, "Shakespeare in the park." And and then he has the line, "Doth mother know you're wearing her drapes?"
Yeah.
So I think the way that Joss Whedon sort of framed this was Branagh did Marvel Comics as Shakespearean theater, and he got to satirize that in Avengers.
As a kid who grew up in New York City and went to see Shakespeare in the Park quite a lot, because back then you could see it for free pretty easily, I love that moment especially.
Actually, Jeff, before you go, I have a question for you. Since it is Thursday when we're doing the show, first of all, happy Thor's Day to you. Yep. What's of all of the films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, what is your favorite Thor moment across all of them?
probably got to be at the start of, near the beginning of Ragnarok, where Thor shows back up in Asgard and they're doing a play within the film, right? And I mean, an extremely Shakespearean moment, of course. But I think you get a Matt Damon cameo in there playing Loki,
right.
and
Sam Neill as Odin.
Yeah, right, exactly. So anytime you have artists who are showing within their art, the creation of art, you have people reflecting on the process of what it means to create art, how we create art, and theories of authorship, theories of audience. And that's fascinating for the many other virtues to recommend the third Thor film. That is one really kind of complex moment.
Such a great one too, yeah.
Jeff, thanks so much for being with us. And I want to ask you a final question that I don't know if you get asked all the time or I'm completely putting you on the spot here, but if you could take any one Shakespeare play and cast it with MCU actors, what do you got?
I would have to think about this a little bit.
Give us the Scottish play. Like, who would you put in for the Scottish play? Or Macbeth, I'm an idiot.
Well, so the fascinating thing about this sort of overlap between, the world of Shakespearean actors and superhero comic films is, as we mentioned, kind of you have to be able to present highly implausible things in believable ways. And in one X-Men film, I think it's the Days of the Future Past one, where you've got different generations coming together. You've got 4 Macbeths in one X-Men film.
Oh, I love that. Yeah,
okay.
Such a great way to think of it.
So what was that? Patrick Stewart.
Right. Fassbender and Ian McKellen and James McAvoy, I think.
Okay.
4 Macbeths in one film.
That's fantastic.
Oh, that's great.
I love that. Well, Jeff, thanks so much for being a part of this. If people want to find you and kind of like your writings or you're thinking about this, or they just want to pester you more about getting you to cast a Shakespeare film, where can they contact? Where can they find your stuff online? Yeah,
always happy to chat with folks. So I'm on Twitter at Dr. Jeffrey Wilson.
Thank you so much for being a part of this. Andy, as always, thank you so much. This is one of the episodes I was so excited about. I really hope we can get you back at some point because there's so much of this that opens my mind up. And to all of our listeners, would love to hear what you have to think, all the ways to contact us at the next reel. Thank you so much for being a part of this and have a nice day.
Thanks so much, gentlemen.
Until next time, true believers.
Marvel Movie Minute is a production of True Story FM, engineering by Andy Nelson. This season's music is One Last Ride by Martin Puringer. Find the show at truestory.fm, and if your podcast app allows ratings and reviews, consider doing that for this show.